Today at Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie, the federal government says it remains committed to restricting and reducing foreign steel imports into the Canadian market to give steel producers a fighting chance. The government is also increasing tariffs on steel imports from non-U.S. countries containing steel melted and poured in China.
We are in the midst of long now and tough negotiations with you.
25% of Canadian steel shipments to America vanished overnight. 1,000 jobs disappeared in March alone. Assembly lines in Detroit ground to a halt as the price of raw materials shot through the roof.
Unfortunately, the answer, Sandy, is yes and no. The steel industry is happy, obviously, with the support that it's getting, including money for displaced workers. This is all good. It also likes the long-term benefits of a buy Canadian mentality. It does not change the fact that the industry has been decimated by the tariffs that are still in place. 50% tariffs for the next 6 months could be, and that is something that the industry has found crippling, Sandy. What they were saying to me today is, we need a deal. It's all very well to have these kind of countervailing tariffs and buy Canadian mentality. Let's get a trade deal done, even if the tariffs in that deal are in place but low.
This isn't some distant economic forecast. It's happening right now, and the shockwaves are rippling through North America's industrial heartland. The moment President Trump announced his 25% tariff on Canadian imports on March 4th, 2025, he triggered something nobody in Washington saw coming. Canada didn't just retaliate, they fundamentally rewrote the rules of North American trade. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response was swift and devastating. Canada would prioritize domestic steel consumption, effectively cutting off the lifeblood of American manufacturing. "We're not just protecting our workers," Carney declared in a nationally televised address. "We're securing Canada's industrial future." Those words sent shivers through boardrooms from Detroit to Pittsburgh. The numbers tell a brutal story. Last year, Canadian steel producers churned out 14 million tons of hot products. Of that, 5.5 million tons crossed the border into American factories, generating 7.3 billion Canadian dollars in revenue. That river of steel powered everything from Ford pickup trucks to wind turbines across the Midwest. Now, with Trump's 30% tariff making exports instantly unprofitable, Ottawa has essentially turned off the tap. François Desmarais of the Canadian Steel Producers Association didn't mince words when he spoke to industry leaders last week. "Basically, all our exports to the U.S. have stopped. This isn't a slowdown, it's a full stop. The human cost is already mounting." Mike Tremblay has worked at a Hamilton steel plant for 22 years. Standing outside the factory gates during a shift change, his weathered hands tell the story of 2 decades shaping metal. "People are scared," he said, his voice barely audible over the industrial hum. "I've got 2 kids in university and a mortgage. If this keeps going, I don't know what will happen next." But here's where Trump's strategy backfired spectacularly. While American manufacturers scramble for alternative suppliers, Canadian factories are firing up dormant furnaces. The blast furnaces along Lake Ontario's shores now glow red through the night, working overtime to meet surging domestic demand. Federal infrastructure investments, liquid hydrogen plants in western provinces, and Atlantic wind projects suddenly have guaranteed access to Canadian steel. The timing couldn't be worse for American automakers. Ford and Stellantis facilities in Michigan have long relied on Canadian steel that could cross the Ambassador Bridge in a single day, transforming into pickup truck bodies by nightfall. Now that same steel carries a 30% premium. Wall Street analysts are already sounding alarms. The price of a new Bronco could jump by $1,800. Trump has fallen into the steel trap he set for himself, observed Dr. Patricia Chen, a trade expert from the University of Toronto. He wanted to protect American jobs, but he's actually destroying them while creating opportunities north of the border. The ripple effects extend far beyond automotive assembly lines. Alberta's oil sands projects require massive pipeline extensions. With American pipe now prohibitively expensive, the Canadian government introduced a domestic steel priority clause. Federal funding for energy projects now depends on using Canadian-made materials. Pittsburgh's pipe manufacturers, who once dominated this market, watch helplessly as their order books empty. This isn't just about steel. It's about the fundamental reshaping of North American supply chains. During the pandemic years, Canada learned a harsh lesson about depending on foreign suppliers. Now, they're applying that knowledge with surgical precision. The produce locally, use locally philosophy has transformed from emergency measure to national policy. The numbers are staggering. Canada's climate targets demand a 40% emissions reduction by 2030. Steel production accounts for 7% of national emissions. By redirecting steel to domestic electric arc furnace projects and green infrastructure, Ottawa is turning Trump's trade war into an environmental victory. 1/3 of furnace conversion costs will come from federal grants, another third from state loans, and the final third from private capital. We're not just keeping our steel, explained Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland at a recent press conference. We're keeping our future. The European Union watches with interest. As Brussels implements its carbon border adjustment mechanism, Canadian steel suddenly looks attractive. Smelted with hydroelectric power, Arctic iron ore carries a carbon footprint advantage that American coal-fired furnaces can't match. While Trump builds walls, Canada builds bridges to Europe, to Asia, to any market willing to pay premium prices for green steel. Congressional reaction has been swift and panicked. The Great Lakes delegation labeled Ottawa's decision a coded export barrier. Representative Jim Morrison from Michigan, waving newspaper headlines during a heated session, declared, "Our neighbor is taking our domestic market and stealing our jobs." Yet the concrete picture tells a different story. When America erected its tariff wall, it forgot that walls work both ways. The broken link in this chain isn't Canadian protectionism, it's Trump's own tax policy. By making Canadian exports unprofitable, he gave Ottawa no choice but to redirect supply chains inward. The Canadian Construction Association initially worried about price pressures from reduced steel availability, but Ottawa had an answer ready: a 35% tax rebate on scrap steel recycling. The numbers are staggering. Canada's climate targets demand a 40% emissions reduction by 2030. Steel production accounts for 7% of national emissions. By redirecting steel to domestic electric arc furnace projects and green infrastructure, Ottawa is turning Trump's trade war into an environmental victory. 1/3 of furnace conversion costs will come from federal grants, another third from state loans, and the final third from private capital. We're not just keeping our steel, explained Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland at a recent press conference. We're keeping our future. The European Union watches with interest. As Brussels implements its carbon border adjustment mechanism, Canadian steel suddenly looks attractive. Smelted with hydroelectric power, Arctic iron ore carries a carbon footprint advantage that American coal-fired furnaces can't match. While Trump builds walls, Canada builds bridges to Europe, to Asia, to any market willing to pay premium prices for green steel. Congressional reaction has been swift and panicked. The Great Lakes delegation labeled Ottawa's decision a coded export barrier. Representative Jim Morrison from Michigan, waving newspaper headlines during a heated session, declared, "Our neighbor is taking our domestic market and stealing our jobs." Yet the concrete picture tells a different story. When America erected its tariff wall, it forgot that walls work both ways. The broken link in this chain isn't Canadian protectionism, it's Trump's own tax policy. By making Canadian exports unprofitable, he gave Ottawa no choice but to redirect supply chains inward. The Canadian Construction Association initially worried about price pressures from reduced steel availability, but Ottawa had an answer ready: a 35% tax rebate on scrap steel recycling. Worn-out bridge steel will be melted down and poured into new infrastructure. Supply and demand will find a new equilibrium, just not one that includes American buyers. Canadian steel must be valued on our soil, Economy Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced. This is our response to the tax wall. He left the door open to Washington, adding, "If the wall is torn down, we will return to the old volumes, but we will keep our leverage." The transformation is already visible on factory floors. The Toronto branch of the United Steelworkers praised the new arrangement as a shield for job security. Union President Mark Ferguson didn't hide his satisfaction. Washington shot its own farmers while building a tax fence, but we are protecting our workers. When Trump first announced tariffs in 2022, Canadian steel employment fell by 10%. Producers couldn't risk exports, so they slowed furnaces and closed lines under the pretext of maintenance. Now, with guaranteed domestic markets, those same factories are posting job openings. The federal budget allocated 1.2 billion Canadian dollars for carbon neutrality projects at steel plants, accelerating investments in cleaner technology. This strategic pivot extends beyond civilian infrastructure. Next year, the Canadian Navy will tender for new icebreakers. Every hull will be forged from domestic steel, transforming a trade dispute into a national security advantage. Defense analysts estimate that military demand alone will absorb 15% of flat steel production, cushioning any export losses. The trap Trump set for himself grows more apparent each day. He promised to protect American manufacturing, but his tariffs have achieved the opposite. Canadian steel that once flowed freely into American factories now stays north of the border, powering Canada's green transformation while American manufacturers face soaring costs and supply shortages. The irony cuts deeper than any steel blade. While American factory workers watch their shifts disappear, Canadian mills are running 24/7. In Sault Ste. Marie, where the steel industry has defined the city for generations, workers are pulling double overtime. Sarah Chen, a third-generation steelworker, checked her phone during a break last Tuesday to find 17 missed calls from American recruiters. "They're offering signing bonuses that would make your head spin," she said, shaking her head. "But I'm not leaving. For the first time in my life, I feel like my job actually matters to my country." The mathematics of this miscalculation are breathtaking. Before the tariffs, American manufacturers enjoyed a competitive advantage. Canadian steel arrived quickly and cheaply, giving them an edge in global markets. Now, they're forced to source from Brazil or South Korea, adding weeks to delivery times and thousands to transportation costs. A steel beam that once traveled 500 miles from Hamilton to Cleveland now ships 5,000 miles from Seoul, burning fossil fuels and time that American factories can't afford to lose. Trump fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern supply chains, explained Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who advises Fortune 500 companies on trade strategy. He thought he could squeeze Canada like a lemon, but instead, he handed them the entire orchard. The construction industry tells the story in concrete terms. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, connecting Detroit and Windsor, requires 120,000 tons of steel. Originally slated to use a mix of American and Canadian materials, the project pivoted overnight. Every beam, every bolt, every reinforcing bar now carries a Made in Canada stamp. American steel companies that bid on the project watched contracts worth $180 million evaporate. But Canada's masterstroke came in the energy sector. The federal government fast-tracked approval for 6 new wind farms in Atlantic Canada, contingent on using domestic steel. Each turbine requires 300 tons of steel. Multiply that by 400 turbines, and you're looking at 120,000 tons of guaranteed demand. The message to Washington was crystal clear. Canada doesn't need American markets when it can create its own. The psychological warfare intensified when Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson toured a Quebec aluminum smelter last month. Standing before gleaming ingots destined for European markets, he delivered a message that reverberated through Washington. Some leaders build walls. We build bridges to new partners who share our values and our vision for a sustainable future. Financial markets have already rendered their verdict. Canadian steel producers' stock prices surged 23% in March, while their American counterparts plummeted. Algoma Steel, once teetering on bankruptcy, announced a billion-dollar expansion. Cleveland Cliffs, America's largest flat-rolled steel company, issued a profit warning and froze hiring. The human dimension of this crisis plays out in factory towns across the Rust Belt. In Youngstown, Ohio, where steel built middle-class dreams for generations, the local food bank reports a 40% increase in demand. Jim Patterson, who spent 30 years at the Republic Steel plant, now drives for Uber to make ends meet. Trump said he'd bring back our jobs, Patterson said, his voice thick with betrayal. Instead, he gave them away to Canada. Meanwhile, Canadian workers are experiencing something unprecedented: job security in an industry notorious for boom-bust cycles. The Hamilton Steelworkers Union negotiated a historic contract guaranteeing no layoffs for 5 years. Training programs for green steel production are oversubscribed, with waiting lists stretching into 2026. "We're not just protecting jobs," union leader Maria Gonzalez explained during a rally outside the Dofasco plant. "We're building a future where our children can work with pride in an industry that respects both workers and the environment." The strategic implications extend far beyond economics. By securing its steel supply, Canada has effectively declared industrial independence from the United States. This shift represents the most significant realignment of North American trade relationships since NAFTA's inception. Where once integration was the watchword, now it's insulation. Energy markets provide another twist in this tale. Canadian steel plants powered by hydroelectricity produce steel with 75% lower emissions than American mills relying on coal. As carbon pricing spreads globally, this advantage translates directly into market access. Japanese automakers, committed to reducing supply chain emissions, are quietly shifting orders from Gary, Indiana to Hamilton, Ontario. The diplomatic fallout has been equally dramatic. During a tense meeting at the White House, Trade Representative Catherine Tai reportedly slammed her folder shut when Canadian officials presented their domestic priority framework. "You're weaponizing climate policy against American workers," she accused. Her Canadian counterpart, Mary Ng, responded coolly, "We're simply responding to the weapons you deployed first." Behind closed doors, American CEOs are furious. General Motors CEO Mary Barra convened an emergency meeting with Michigan's congressional delegation, warning that production costs could spike by 12%. "The president's tariffs aren't protecting American jobs," she said, according to sources present. "They're destroying our competitive position globally." The knock-on effects ripple through seemingly unrelated industries. American wind energy projects dependent on Canadian steel for turbine towers face delays and cost overruns. The Biden administration's infrastructure bill allocated $75 billion for renewable energy, but without affordable steel, those projects are grinding to a halt. Texas wind farms sit half-built, their concrete foundations curing in the sun while developers scramble for steel they can afford. Indigenous communities along the Canadian Shield, where iron ore feeds the steel mills, have negotiated groundbreaking benefit-sharing agreements. The Cree Nation of Wamingji secured a 15% stake in a new mine development, transforming Trump's trade war into an opportunity for reconciliation and economic justice. "For too long, our resources left our land with nothing in return," explained Grand Chief Abel Bossum. "Now, every ton of ore creates opportunity for our youth." The technical evolution accelerates under pressure. Canadian steel researchers at McMaster University unveiled a breakthrough in hydrogen-based steel production, cutting emissions by 95%. With guaranteed domestic markets and federal research grants, Canada is positioning itself as the global leader in green steel technology. American companies, struggling with tariff-inflated costs, can barely afford to keep existing furnaces running, let alone invest in revolutionary technology. Wall Street analysts are beginning to grasp the full scope of Trump's miscalculation. A recent Goldman Sachs report titled "The Great Steel Reversal" predicts that American manufacturing competitiveness will decline by 15% over the next 5 years. The president intended to protect American industry, the report notes with barely concealed alarm. Instead, he's accelerated its decline while supercharging Canadian competition. The political reverberations are just beginning. Midwest governors, watching manufacturing jobs evaporate, are breaking ranks with the White House. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer called for an emergency summit with Canadian premiers, bypassing Washington entirely. "If the federal government won't protect our workers, we'll negotiate directly," she declared, marking an unprecedented challenge to presidential trade authority. As spring turns to summer, the new reality settles over North America like morning mist on the Great Lakes. Steel that once flowed as freely as water between neighbors now stops at borders transformed into economic barriers. In Canadian mills, furnaces burn bright with possibility. In American factories, the lights grow dimmer each day. The trap Trump set has sprung, but he caught the wrong prey. While he aimed for Canada, He snared American manufacturing in a web of his own making.